It's early Saturday morning in Virginia. The date is March 16, 1957, and the time is 8 a.m. to the second. Somewhere in Alexandria, a 300-foot-long spacecraft has just landed on a field, and when the door of this craft opens, out walks not an alien, but a man, who besides his odd clothing and 12 fingers, looks very human. The landing of this spacecraft immediately draws the attention of the local police, who quickly approach with their guns cocked and ready to attack if need be. The strange man, however, smiles at them rather charmingly, waves hello, and makes a simple request. "I need to speak with the president," he says. For some reason, the officers feel obligated to fulfill this strange man's request. So, after engaging the appropriate protocols, the man is escorted to meet with President Dwight Eisenhower in the Oval Office. Months after this auspicious meeting, the space race would commence, NASA would be formed, and an unprecedented avalanche of technological inventions that continue to shape our world today would follow. Those who know better say that all of these achievements can be traced back to the arrival of that strange visitor at the Pentagon. They aren't wrong. On March 16, 1957, a strange-looking man landed in Virginia on a spacecraft, asking to speak with President Eisenhower. Something about this strange man made the police, who had rushed to the scene, unwilling to attack him. In fact, they felt strangely obligated to grant his request. So, they made some calls and escorted him to the White House. When the strange visitor arrived at the White House, he was immediately ushered into the Oval Office, where he would meet with President Eisenhower. "Of course," said the president. "You know we have suspended all rules of protocol. I have a good feeling toward you. Please, sir, what is your name? And where do you come from?" "Valiant," answered the stranger. "I come from the planet your Bible calls the morning and the evening star." And with that, he proceeded to hand Eisenhower a letter of introduction. The planet Valiant Thor, or Val for short, had been referring to was Venus. Venus was Val's home planet, but he also belonged to an intergalactic governing body made up of a variety of intelligent species from across many different planets, many of which we Earthlings don't even know exist. According to Val, this governing body, called the High Council, has been observing our planet for hundreds of years. But it was our growing fascination with atomic bombs that worried them and forced them to intervene. Val had come with a message of peace, requesting world leaders to turn away from their selfishness and work together for the common good. Particularly, Val had requested that all countries with nuclear weapons disarm so that in exchange, the benevolent extraterrestrial species would reward Earth with technology and solutions that could end poverty and disease in the world forever. The offer was obviously attractive, even though Eisenhower had his reservations. But the more pressing issue remained verifying Val's claims. Was Valiant Thor who he claimed to be? Sure, he looked extremely handsome in an otherworldly way. He had 6 fingers on each hand, and his outfit, a silver and gold jumpsuit, wasn't like anything people of Earth wore generally. Still, the president needed to be sure, so he had Val escorted to the Pentagon, where he would live in a tastefully furnished underground apartment for the next 3 years. And then, he rounded up a team of scientists and investigators to look into Val. As you may have already suspected, each test they carried out only served to prove Val's claims. To begin with, Val was obviously highly intelligent. He had an IQ of 1200 and could speak over 100 human languages. Val's physiology was also completely different from that of an average human. Not only did the Venusian have 12 fingers, he also had no fingerprint. Plus, internally, his heart was oversized, and he had only one giant lung, rather than 2 normal-sized ones. However, the most striking and head-scratching thing about Val was his outfit. The silver and gold jumpsuit had such incredible capabilities that it was immediately nicknamed a miracle garment. Val's jumpsuit was very soft to the touch and barely weighed 6 ounces, boots included. Yet the outfit proved to be pretty much indestructible. All kinds of tests were carried out on the outfit to try and destroy it, from pouring acid on it to firing a rifle at it. But they had no effect, not even when they tried using a diamond drill or a laser beam to cut through the cloth. The outfit remained untouched, not even a scratch. The fabric was obviously not of this world, which meant that its owner was probably not of this world either. Whatever Val was proposing, Eisenhower now had proof that he could deliver on it. But was the world ready for this new world order that Val was proposing? Would Eisenhower's officials listen to him? Would the world listen to him? The president had his doubts, and he shared those feelings with Val. He really wanted to accept Val's offer of help, but he felt that doing that could negatively affect America's economy. Plus, he wasn't sure his fellow Earthlings would approve of Val's suggestions, and as it turned out, his fears were valid. When certain officials were brought in to deliberate on Val's offer, the response was unanimous. Sure, Val's ideas could end diseases and plagues and what have you, but these leaders feared that if they were to execute Val's plans, it could put them in a position where they were in Val's debt. Moreover, they didn't want their people abandoning their leadership and following Val instead. So, as far as they were concerned, Val's offer was a no-go. Per his assignment from the High Council, Val's mission to convince Earth's leaders to amend their ways was to last 3 years. Unfortunately, the ones he had met weren't interested in that. But seeing as his stay on Earth was to last 3 years anyway, the US government invited him to assist with certain projects in the space sciences. Val obviously didn't like this arrangement, but he graciously agreed while still trying his best to get his hosts to reconsider their decision. At the end of his 3-year stay, Val still hadn't achieved much success. Nevertheless, his mission had officially ended, and it was time for him to return to the High Council with feedback. So, on March 16, 1960, exactly 3 years after Valiant Thor had landed his spaceship, Victor 1, on planet Earth, the Venusian visitor dematerialized and left Earth. Rumor has it, however, that he did not leave permanently. Apparently, after reporting the results of his mission to the High Council, Val was given instructions to go back to Earth, living as an Earthling, and provide guidance to those genuinely striving for world peace. And that's exactly what Val did. In fact, it is said that Val's spaceship is still among us today. Specifically, the ship is said to be located close to Lake Mead near Las Vegas, where it's been camouflaged so no one can see it. According to those who have been there, you can still feel the energy and vibrations coming from Victor 1, even though you can't see it. They say birds tend to avoid flying through that space, almost like an invisible obstruction is keeping them from flying through, and that when you throw rocks at the area where the ship is alleged to hover, the rocks bounce right back. Perhaps when you're next in Vegas, you could check out Lake Mead and confirm things for yourself. In the meantime, however, let's explore key witnesses and evidence surrounding the Valiant Thor mystery. For a story as wild as the Valiant Thor mystery, you might expect a convenient absence of evidence, but not in this case. From photographic evidence to testimonies from family members of high-ranking government officials, including Eisenhower's own descendant, there's quite a bit of evidence to sort through when exploring the mystery of Valiant Thor. Let's begin with the photographic evidence, and then we'll take a look at 4 key witnesses who have corroborated the Valiant Thor legend. About a month after Val arrived, he was invited for a UFO convention at the home of famous alien abductee Howard Menger in High Bridge, New Jersey. Being his usual good-natured self, Val accepted the invitation, and with the company of his 3 crew members who had been with him since he arrived on Earth, he made his way to Highbridge. By the way, the crew members were named Dawn, Jill, and Tanya. The meeting itself turned out to be uneventful for the most part. However, there was a curious young photographer in attendance who was immediately fascinated by Val and his crew. His name was August C. Roberts, and he immediately proceeded to take numerous pictures of the 4 humanoids. Looking at these photos, you might think to yourself that these might just be random photos of anonymous people, and not necessarily Venusian visitors. And that's a fair retort. However, that's just the thing. It's been nearly 70 years since Roberts took these photos, and they've been fairly popular on the internet for some years now. At least among those interested in UFOlogy. Why hasn't anyone come to debunk these photos since then? I mean, if these guys aren't from Venus, then they must be related to someone, right? So why hasn't anyone come forward to say that someone in the photo was related to them somehow? Or did each of these guys in the photo orchestrate an elaborate scam with every single one of their family members and friends? And let's even say they did. There were other people at the event, obviously. Why hasn't anyone from that event said anything all these years? Or were they all in on the scam too? The insurmountable conditions required to orchestrate such a vast scheme makes that option highly improbable. Besides, these photos came out way before AI, so this isn't a case of AI forgery either, which leaves us with only 2 possible options with these photos. It's either they are fake or they are genuine. And right now, the conditions around these photos seem to prove that they are indeed genuine. This leads us to our first key witness in the Valiant Thor mystery, Dr. Frank Stranges. Dr. Frank Stranges was a Christian minister and a private UFO investigator. His first encounter with Val came when Roberts, the photographer at the Highbridge UFO event, had sent him the photos he had taken. Frank found the people in the pictures just as fascinating as Roberts had found them. At the time, he used to go around giving lectures about UFOs, so he added Roberts' photos to his paraphernalia for his lectures. One day, during one of his sessions at the National Evangelistic Center in Washington, D.C., Frank was approached by a woman who gave her name as Nancy Warren. Nancy was an employee at the Pentagon, at least that's what her ID said, and she had come to invite Frank to meet with Val personally. Obviously, Frank was excited and immediately jumped at the offer. Being a UFO investigator himself, Frank said he was on the lookout for anything that could signal to him that Val was a fraud. Unfortunately for him, he was sorely disappointed. As they continued to talk, Val told Frank many things. He told Frank that he wasn't the only Venusian present on Earth at the time. There were 76 others. Val also told Frank numerous things about Frank himself that even he didn't know before then. But then when he asked his parents and grandparents, they all checked out. His grandparents were still alive at the time. With America's leaders rejecting his offer, Val was hoping that Frank could help him get his message across to the world. He did warn, however, that doing this would come with the cost of persecution, harassment, and threats to his life. And just as Val predicted, all of these things happened precisely. Once Frank started sharing the messages he received from Val, his life automatically became more horrifying than a nightmare. There were multiple attempts on his life almost everywhere he went. One time, it was food poisoning. Another time, he got abducted and was beaten to within an inch of his life. Then, during his honeymoon, he and his wife were run off the road by a mysterious black car, leading to a ghastly incident that broke his neck and hips. Each of these times, however, Frank showed a miraculous recovery because Val would show up and heal him. You can read more about Frank's wild experience with Valiant Thor, including how he got a tour of Victor 1, in his book, Stranger at the Pentagon. I'll leave a link down in the description so you can go into that rabbit hole if you want to. But for now, let's move on to our second star witness, Phil Schneider. And once again, there is photographic evidence. Before we talk about Phil Schneider's relationship with the Valiant Thor mystery, it might be important to give some perspective. When it comes to government whistleblowing, few names are as popular or as notorious as Phil Schneider. Schneider worked with the US government as a geologist and engineer, and apparently got his hands on some highly classified, indicting information against the US government, which he proceeded to share with the public. I'm talking about pretty damning of all kinds of things, from secret treaties with extraterrestrials to underground military bases hiding UFOs and alien technology. For a long time, most people thought Schneider was just crazy and making stuff up. But then he died in January 1996, and it became clear that Schneider was onto something. As usual, Schneider's death was ruled out as a suicide at first, but further investigations would show that there was a lot of foul play involved. For instance, the scene of Schneider's alleged suicide had looked more like a military-style execution than a suicide. Also, all of Schneider's notes and unwritten books on UFOs were mysteriously spirited away from his apartment, while his money and valuables were suspiciously left intact. I mean, need I say more? It's obvious that certain powers that be were upset with Schneider's whistleblowing, which could only mean that the man was telling the truth about the things he said. And one of the government secrets Schneider exposed was Valiant Thor's stay at the Pentagon. Phil Schneider was 10 when Val visited Earth for the first time, so he didn't get to meet Val. His father, however, met with Val during a meeting with some of the leading nuclear scientists of the day. Apparently, Val had been in attendance at that meeting, and Schneider had photographic evidence to prove it. You're probably wondering if this picture is legitimate in the first place. Well, if you look at this photo, up here in front is Val, allegedly. Oscar Schneider, Phil's father, is right behind him. And if you take a look at these men to your left, they do look like two leading nuclear scientists of that time. The one leaning on the wall seems to be Arthur Holly Compton, who worked on the Manhattan Project and won a Nobel Prize. And then, beside him, is a man who looks like Carl T. Compton, the man who helped to invent the radar and the atomic bomb. So it would appear that this photo is legitimate. The only question now would be whether this man being identified as Val is actually Val. But once again, no one has debunked Schneider's claims, leaving us to lean towards the assumption that this photo is indeed genuine and that an extraterrestrial by the name of Valiant Thor really did work at the Pentagon in the late 50s. We've got two other key witnesses to look at, but we aren't going to spend so much time going into each of their claims for the sake of time. These witnesses are heavy hitters though. We've got Harley Andrew Byrd, nephew to Admiral Richard Byrd. We've also got Laura Eisenhower, great-granddaughter of President Eisenhower. And these guys' testimonies really do take this controversy to a whole new level. On the morning of Val's arrival on Earth, after the Venusian visitor requested to speak with the president, Harley Andrew Byrd was one of the first people to be contacted. Byrd was a high-ranking official at the Pentagon at the time. He was also a top consultant for Project Blue Book, a highly classified military research program that studied UFOs between 1952 and 1969. So he had the necessary clearance to be made aware of such highly classified matters. Intriguingly, the way Byrd narrates the arrival mission and appearance of Val is exactly the same as the popular account we have of Valiant Thor. Byrd even confirms Dr. Frank's involvement. And once again, his story is the same as what Frank himself narrates. You can read more about that in Stranger at the Pentagon, by the way. As for Laura Eisenhower, Eisenhower's great-granddaughter, she also confirms the existence of Valiant Thor. According to her, her great-grandfather had really wanted to take Val up on his offer, But those around him shot down the idea, and it really devastated him. Now, Eisenhower's famous warning about the growing military-industrial complex in his 1961 farewell speech might just seem like great advice, and it is. But there's some context to that warning that may lend some credence to the idea that Eisenhower encountered something life-changing in his terms as president. Consider the fact that before Eisenhower became president, he was a war hero, a general in the army. Simply put, Eisenhower was a military man's military man, not exactly the kind of person you think would counsel the nation to simmer down on her military ambitions, and yet he did. It obviously sounds like the man went through a life-changing experience. And couldn't that have had something to do with Val? But here's a fun fact. Even though Eisenhower gave his famous farewell speech in 1961 after his tenure ended, records show that he actually began writing the speech 2 years earlier in 1959. That falls right within the period when Val worked at the Pentagon. So, could Val's words have been the reason for the former general's sudden change of heart towards militaristic expansion? Well, his great-granddaughter says yes. So, we've examined all the key evidence supporting this story. We've also looked through all the witnesses, none of whom had anything to gain by making up stories about how an extraterrestrial being made his home at the Pentagon. Up to this point, the evidence looks convincing. But skeptics have their doubts. And as you're about to find out, just as many things about this story make it believable, many things about this story also make it doubtful. Perhaps the most glaring red flag is the claim that Valiant Thor came from Venus. You don't even need Rajesh Kuthrapali from The Big Bang Theory to tell you that Venus is entirely uninhabitable. The planet's proximity to the sun alone makes it a flaming ball of hell with a temperature that's as high as 900 degrees. Venus also has the densest atmosphere of all the terrestrial planets in our solar system, with its atmosphere made almost entirely of carbon dioxide and the planet itself suspended in a dense cloud of sulfuric acid. Considering all of these factors, chances that Venus can support life, much less super-evolved life forms like Valiant Thor and his crew, are very low. But let's even play ball and accept that somehow Val and his race found a way to survive on Venus. Wouldn't it be suspicious how Val could land on Earth and immediately adapt to our vastly different atmospheric conditions? Which takes us to the source of the whole Valiant Thor story itself. Everything we know about Valiant Thor and his time at the Pentagon comes from Dr. Frank Strange's book, Stranger at the Pentagon. But there are several issues with this book, starting with the credibility of its author. Simply put, Frank wasn't exactly the most credible source. Most of his credentials were even fake to start with. For instance, he called himself Dr. Frank Strange's, claiming that he got 2 doctorates in psychology and philosophy from Faith Theological Seminary. But while that college is real and accredited, it does not hand out PhDs in either of the fields Frank claimed he had a doctorate in. Frank also claimed to have worked as the Assistant Deputy Director of the California State Marshal Association. But no such group exists, not to mention the fact that California does not have state marshals. These red flags alone already question the credibility of Frank's book, and we aren't even done. There are more worrying things about this book, a major one being a lack of substantial evidence. Sure, Frank includes some photos, and yes, these photos have not been debunked to this day, but they've also not been confirmed by anyone either. The fact that no one has come out to debunk the photos cannot be the sole reason these pictures are accepted as legitimate. Some might say, but we have high-quality witnesses confirming the existence of Valiant Thor. And yes, we do. But once again, these witnesses aren't exactly the most credible. Harley Andrew Byrd, for instance, almost always signed his name by mentioning that he was the nephew of Admiral Richard Byrd. Unfortunately, there's no way to conclusively prove that. I'll leave a link to his page on Ancestry.com so you can check him out for yourself. Still, say we accept that Harley was Admiral Byrd's nephew. There are still holes in Harley's claims. For instance, if we follow the timeline of his story, then Byrd would have had to be working in a senior role with Project Blue at the age of 18, which sounds incredulous to say the least. As for Laura Eisenhower, she is Eisenhower's great-granddaughter, no doubt about that, but is she the best source? Besides the fact that she does not provide hard evidence for her claims, she's also more of a pseudoscientist. Yet another reason skeptics do not take her claims seriously. But perhaps nothing else raises more doubts about Frank Strange's book than the fact that it was written about 10 years after the event it claimed to report. This is significant because Frank claims he met Valiant Thor in 1957, which, if true, would easily be one of the most important events to ever happen to the human race. But then, not only does Frank keep oddly mum about his experience until 10 years later, but he writes 2 books on UFOs in that same time period. However, not once in either of these books does he mention Valiant Thor. Isn't that strange? Something definitely doesn't add up. Did Frank Strange's really meet a Venusian, or did he make this story up? Considering all the factors, it seems like the Reverend made the story up. And it definitely doesn't help that Frank's account sounds very close to the plot of the 1951 movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. The only reason I give this story a second thought is because of the death of Phil Schneider. The events surrounding his death and his missing files scream cover-up. After all, dead men tell no tales, and with Phil dead, it is difficult to see if this was true or false. Ultimately, deciding what you want to believe about this case is up to you. But whatever conclusion you come to, you can't deny that Val's message, whether he was real or not, is really needed in our world today. Val wanted us to turn aside from the warpath and work together for the common good, so the High Council could reward us with technology and solutions to end poverty and disease. But even if no such intergalactic body exists, the advice remains sound. And maybe, if we as a planet decide to take it, we may discover groundbreaking technological advancements that end poverty and disease in our world today. Speaking of technological advancements, ever wonder what happened to the human race in the 31st century? A time traveler from 3906 has all the answers. Click here to learn more about Paul Amadeus Denock, the time traveler who spent an entire year in the future in the body of another man.